about bringing together two projects that have been working in the university in an interdisciplinary way, so sociological, social policy, socio-legal work, and looking at how, or hopefully disseminating some of how those projects have been working and thinking about how we can work together. The idea behind this, we're very grateful to the ESRC for funding this day. It's funded under an impact stream, and impact is about recognising that research can have utility beyond the ivory towers of academia.
So we commissioned two political scientists, Matthew Goodwin and Oliver Heath, to do some analysis using the British election study to look at that question of what was the role of poverty, place and individual circumstances in explaining the vote to leave the EU. So our first significant finding is that income did matter. This was a thing about individual characteristics. The poorer you are, the more likely you were to vote leave. Education actually mattered most. So once you look at the two of them together, it really was educational status that was the biggest predictor of how someone would vote. The third really key finding from the report is on the importance of place. We came up with this idea of essentially being, as described in the report, of a double whammy of being low-skilled and living in a low-skilled area. So people without educational qualifications and skills, if they're in these left-behind areas, these places with fewer opportunities, and those are characterised by being low-skill areas, then they also have fewer opportunities because of that. And this fed into this feeling of being economically disadvantaged. One thing you can maybe draw from this is that if you want to secure migrant rights, if you wanted more liberal policies towards migration, it perhaps means you need to solve some of these divides to get over that feeling of economic disadvantage and get broader support for that.
We know that from political scientist research that people are not so fixed in terms of their preferences on the European Union. They're much more fixed on their preferences on how they would vote domestically. So specific issues and the issues how these were framed in the political campaigns in the run-up to the referendum. Very unsurprisingly, the economy was the most important issue among those who wanted to stay in the European Union. Now, for those that wanted to leave, the economy didn't even make 5%, and actually immigration and sovereignty were much more important. So the connection between migration and welfare, the connection between migration and the economy, and so on and so forth, it was portrayed in terms of anger. Anger against a threat, a perceived threat towards the community by the European Union, which is an illegitimate authority. One of the problems of the in-campaign is that it also framed its campaign negatively, in terms of negative emotions, which were fear. Actually, fear is an emotion that actually, instead of mobilizing you, makes you stay at home and not do anything about it.
I'm just going to introduce the wider project, which is called Welfare Conditionality, Sanction Support and Behaviour Change. So essentially, we're questioning how welfare conditionality works, but also whether or not it can be seen as fair and in what kind of circumstances people feel that it's fair. In terms of what we're presenting today, we're looking at our ongoing work to explore two questions, and that is how does welfare conditionality impact on the lives of EU migrants resident in the UK, and why is conditionality important in understanding the restriction and removal of UK resident EU migrants' rights. We are arguing that welfare conditionality today works to disadvantage EU migrants at three different levels, which Peter will talk a little bit about.
EU citizenship at one level is a conditional promise for those member state nationals who relocate to another member state. Under the coalition government, the UK government was very active in implementing negative changes to the rights of EU migrants. So we can see that, this idea that destitution and homelessness does come out of these kinds of rules. Generally, there was inadequate, inappropriate mandatory training and support. Not always, but the dominant voice is the training didn't amount to much. It didn't help me get a job. And What welfare chauvinism amounts to is that, particularly in times of economic recession, migrants face reduced or restricted entitlements to support in comparison to national citizens. What we've got today in the UK is a sort of unique, what I'm calling a constellation of conditionality. A number of things have come together. We've got austerity, we've had the referendum, we've got Brexit happening in about half an hour's time. We've got this work-first conditional welfare state. And as restrictive national UK immigration and welfare policies continue to intersect, and migrants' everyday encounters play out against a backdrop of behavioural conditionality, rather pessimistically, I think it's likely that EU migrants' rights in the future will be further diminished. I certainly cannot see them being enhanced.
I'm very happy to be here to begin to talk about some of the initial findings I've had from my doctoral research. I basically interviewed 15 migrants from Eastern Europe who were in different stages of homelessness. Some were sleeping rough, some were in temporary accommodation, some were in incredibly overcrowded conditions, etc. And what became very clear to me is that when people are confronted with constrained choice, when you don't have the ability to earn wages to support yourself, you then turn to the informal economy, either through casual work, cash in hand, or maybe even illicit activity, or you rely on charity and donations or begging. Some participants in my study were very clear about having no choice whatsoever. What struck me about these interviews was the level of deprivation. Another thing that struck me with the interviews is the very low level of expectations people had for intervention from state and state assistance. And on the other end of the spectrum, some people I spoke with were very adamant about the amount of choice that they had, sleeping rough as being their choice, and that they're exercising that choice. In making sense of this, I don't want it to make it sound that people are actually choosing homelessness. The way that I'm interpreting them is the exact lack of choice that people have, that people are being made to deprioritize their housing to the point of homelessness. I'm sure nobody in this room has the exact answers of how Brexit will unfold, but you can only imagine that any further restriction on the ability to work will only further push people into an informal economy, greater reliance on cash in hand, and so on and so forth, and maybe even creating even more opportunities for exploitation in the labour market.
Is access to the European Social Fund something that local authorities are worried about? And I'm thinking specifically local authorities, not local enterprise partnerships, because obviously European funding is a huge issue for them, but specifically local authorities in the context of welfare reform. Is the loss of this ESF money something they're concerned about? And what will happen if access to the European Social Fund and the European Structural Investment Funds are not replaced and local authorities and other organisations are left without this support? A huge bunch of people who might well be affected by welfare reforms, and the idea is that this European Social Fund money can be used to support some of those populations who might be particularly affected by universal credit in particular, but not just universal credit, broader problems like homelessness and so on. Within the current local authority fiscal environment, money for welfare support functions is particularly at risk, or money to support particularly specialised welfare reform functions is non-existent. There's a higher need groups are increasingly reliant on local authority support, particularly English as a second language assistance and so on, as support's removed nationally for that sort of function. And finally, the pace of change, particularly in universal credit, creates new and unpredictable demands on services offered by local authorities. The ESF money is being built in to what you'd expect local authorities to be doing anyway, which is making and awarding discretionary housing payments. And European Social Fund money is being tied into this process to help provide extra layers of support, which should really be available anyway without recourse to this money. But of course, local authorities have very little alternative cash to turn to.
The likelihood is we're looking at 3.3 million people resident in the UK. It seems highly unlikely that we're talking about getting rid of everybody. So there's going to be a line drawn between who gets to stay and who doesn't, and what their rights are going to be. And so it could be very, very important to be guarding the rights of people to reside over these next 2 years and making sure that rights up until now are suitably demonstrated so that future claims to permanent residence aren't scuppered. So what have been the aims of the project? Well, the aims from the outset were to compare the law in the books to the law in the real world, the aims of any sort of socio-legal project, really. Doing that through legal action research. Equal treatment has largely been an illusion, particularly since the introduction of the immigration EEA regs 2006 onwards, and the concept of the right to reside. Poor decision making and poor interpretation by decision makers of key concepts, and poor decision maker guidance that's being issued to them, and inaccurate guidance. The kind of normalisation of delay in the process is tantamount to a refusal without the right of appeal. At least if you've had a refusal, you can appeal it. If you're just waiting and waiting, there's nothing you can do. What are going to be the practical outcomes of the project so far? So I've been actively involved in litigation, but also offering litigation support to organisations representing clients in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. Inputting into consultations, both at European level, the Commission, and national level, the Social Security Advisory Commission, and banging in infringement complaints to the European Commission, and advising the Advising EU Migrants Toolkit. And the idea of this is to produce, well, what we're in the process of doing, an online toolkit that will help advisors navigate through and explore different possible options. But it's really important to be thinking about all of these kinds of ways of asserting and enforcing particular rights, especially given that during periods of legal transition, the risks to administrative justice are more acute. And we are facing the mother of all legal transitions right now. And so there is a danger that decision makers are going to be overwhelmed, confused, reduced capacity, and also dealing with very significant and very, very complex changes. And we ought to be making sure that we're holding authorities to account. Thank you very much.